There's an elephant in the room at Eurovision this year, and it's time we talked about it. To be honest, I have had serious doubts making this video. I have had serious doubts writing it, and now when I'm recording it even. But I don't think it would be honest to talk about Eurovision this year without talking about this. I don't think it's ethical to do so either. This video is going to cover a few things. Firstly, we're going to talk about how the contest is political, about how Eurovision has always been political, always will be, you can't avoid it. Secondly, we're going to talk about how Israel and Azerbaijan specifically have used the contest for political reasons in the past and how that is especially relevant and controversial this year. I'm also going to talk about why I think the EBU has taken the decisions it has taken with regard to keeping them in the contest. And I'm going to talk about why I feel I need to talk about this if I'm going to cover Eurovision in an ethical way this year. The views in this video are my own. They do not represent my employer or any organization I am affiliated with, whether that's professionally or privately. They do not represent the views of any other news outlet other than this channel. All the events referenced in this video are widely documented, publicly available, and come from reputable sources. Firstly, to state the obvious, Eurovision has always been political. It was political in 1990 when the Berlin Wall came down, and there were loads of songs which invoked tearing walls down. It was political in 2022 when Kalisz called on Western powers to save the defenders of Azovstal in Mariupol.
I ask all of you, please help Ukraine, Mariupol. Help Azovstal right now.
There has always been this political element to the contest, and countries will always continue to invoke it when they can. For obvious reasons, the politicization of the contest has become a big controversy this year, especially surrounding the inclusion of Israel, which has sparked calls for boycotting the contest. It sparked calls for them to be expelled. To a lesser extent, these calls have also come regarding Azerbaijan. The reason for this is obviously the actions of those countries in Artsakh and in Gaza. I'm not a geopolitics expert, so I'm not going to be able to solve those conflicts in this video, and neither am I going to try to. I'm also not a historian or a conflict journalist, and because of that, there is only so much I can say while being on solid ground when talking about these conflicts. For that reason, there's videos linked below which will tell you a bit more about the history of both of them that I learned a lot from when I watched them. In addition, you should be getting your news from reputable sources, journalists on the ground who are bravely bringing reporting on what is happening every single day. Those are the people who you need to get your information from, not Eurovision YouTubers. For that reason, I don't think it's responsible for me to talk about these conflicts in detail outside of the prism of Eurovision. I recognize that I'm privileged to sit in a warm house like this and talk about Eurovision when these things are happening. What I can hopefully do in this video is shed a bit of light on how these countries have used Eurovision politically in the past and how the last few months has moved the dial on this, how it has changed this year. I can also hopefully explain a little of why I think the EBU has taken the actions, or rather not taken the actions, that it has done. Let's get one thing out of the way now, because there's always some clever guy in the comments who says about Israel and Azerbaijan not being in Europe, here's a map of the European broadcasting area. They're in it. Moving on. Let's explore a few different directions here to show why this matters, why the politicization of Eurovision in this way matters. And to use that, I first want to talk about when Israel and Azerbaijan last hosted the contest. That was in Baku in 2012 and in Tel Aviv in 2019. Both countries adopted a nothing to see here, everything's fine sort of approach, though Qatari, of course, did their best to shatter this illusion in Tel Aviv in 2019. Both countries were banking on the fact that the EBU wouldn't want too much of a scene to be made and would allow certain things to slide in order for the contest to go off smoothly. There's a lot of similarities we can see here. Both countries used the postcards before each song as basically straight up tourist adverts. Israel at least did have the artists in them, but the Azeri postcards were literally just tourist adverts with zero else to them. This isn't unique, to be clear. Lots of countries do this, but it was remarkable, especially with Azerbaijan, that the artists were totally deprioritized in the postcard. They were so clearly geared towards the country and the look at us and the come visit us and spend lots of money side of things, which was unusual even in modern Eurovision. Interestingly, Kan, the Israeli broadcaster in 2019, actually explicitly took the decision not to use locations in the occupied West Bank for the postcards, which actually went against the desires of the government, who were so outraged that the Minister of Culture at the time, Miri Regev, actually spoke out against it, saying that it was an unfortunate decision, that the West Bank was an integral part of Israel, and that her ministry would not allow this. However, Khan didn't actually stick fully to this decision. The drone shots that were in use for the Israeli postcard included shots of East Jerusalem, which is not internationally recognized as part of Israel. What's interesting here is that Azerbaijan actually did a similar thing by filming their own postcard in what Azeris know as Karabakh. Whether this was a conscious decision or not, it's really interesting to me that both broadcasters reached the same conclusion here, where they used internationally disputed territory as their own postcards specifically. This was not the case for any other postcard in the show at both editions, just these ones. This subconscious or almost subconscious pushing of a certain agenda during these editions was borne out in a whole variety of places. I've used this example, but you could also point to Hatari's press conference being ended immediately by the host when a journalist asked a question that related to Gaza.
With whatever is happening in the south, do you have any comment? Does that change anything?
You know what? You just really have no more time.
So
So
finish the question.
Freedom of expression and
no, I think no, of course, but first of all, I think that they already answered, and there are rules of the timing. So you just told me to stop, so I'm just the time is out. So
a more blatant example of this in Baku would be the fact that Armenia wasn't even able to participate in the contest because they weren't satisfied with the security guarantees that they received from Azerbaijan. So they were forced to withdraw. Was this mentioned during the contest? Of course not. They simply weren't there. This is an example of how it isn't just what is there that shows you how the contest is political. It's what isn't there. It's what the host countries choose to omit, what they choose to hide, or what they choose to simply not mention. Now, let's focus a little bit more in on 2019 in Tel Aviv for a minute, because there's a second issue I want to bring up here. We're going to come around to it, but it's going to take a little bit of explanation, so bear with me. Tel Aviv and Israel has long been marketed by both its government and their tourism agencies as a haven for LGBT people in the Middle East, as a progressive beacon among some not so progressive neighbors. We saw this in the show in 2019 by the inclusion of a performance by trans woman Dana International, who won the contest in the 90s, and by a kiss cam that included same-sex couples. We can all agree, or at least I hope we can, that LGBT rights are a good thing. And if you don't agree with that, I don't really know why you're watching this video. That aside, the reason this caused particular conversation in 2019 and has done for a long time is that Israel has a long documented history of promoting its position on LGBT rights in order to position itself as a bastion of Western liberal values in the Middle East. The argument here is that positioning itself in this way allows it to distract from its actions in Gaza and the West Bank. The 2019 contest, in many people's view, was an example of this, and given that 182 million people watched the show, it's difficult to argue with it. The kind of positive coverage that the host city and host country receive during Eurovision is the kind that money can't buy. This is especially important to a country like Israel, which has long traded on its status as a democratic liberal nation in a neighborhood where that is rare. Quick disclaimer on this one, there's arguments about this too, but again, there are many brilliant video essays, many brilliant articles on the status of Israel's democracy and whether it truly is a democracy. I will leave the discussion on that to them rather than having it here. It's just a vital part of this point, so I had to mention it. Another example of this, which has come up just in this last year, and I touched on this in the iceberg videos, some saw this same positioning in the lyrics of Unicorn by Noah Carell. I'll put a couple of examples on screen so you can make your own mind up. We don't know this for sure, which is why I'm mentioning it, but not going to go too much into it. But given that Noah has since been extremely vocal in her political pronouncements on social media, I would suggest that this theory probably does have some weight. We don't know it for sure though, so make your own mind up on that one. Like I say, I've given you the evidence to see for yourself. What is the relevance of Eurovision in the bigger picture here? Now, I think we can talk about Israel and Azerbaijan in the same breath here, because actually a lot of countries do this. It's not just them. Eurovision is a brilliant tool to legitimize yourself. You get an opportunity to compete alongside 40-ish other countries on the international stage. What this means is in those 3 minutes, you can push whatever image of your country you want, and that will be people's main message, their main takeaway about you and your nation on that evening. The importance of this has changed over time. For Azerbaijan, as a new nation emerging in the 90s and 2000s and the early 2010s, it was especially important. However, this has diminished in the last few years because Azerbaijan has become geopolitically useful to the West in other ways because of its natural gas reserves, which since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have become critical. For Israel, however, this need has not diminished at all. There is a vested interest in Israel to portray a certain image through Eurovision to the wider European public. It's important to Israel that people watching the contest identify with the values that Israel is trying to portray through its entries, because that public opinion is vital to Israel's survival. To be clear, this is a strategy that operates across a whole variety of ways, and lots of different countries operate in this way to promote themselves, to promote their interests. Ultimately, Israel needs a certain public mood in order to continue to further its goals in a neighborhood where they are very unpopular. Israel wants to be perceived in a positive light, in a certain way. It wants to be associated with the things that we've said, things like openness and liberal values. It's in their interest to be portrayed in that way, and that's why they use Eurovision as a tool to do that. As for why Eurovision contributes to this, just the act of entering Eurovision gives the impression that you subscribe to the values of the contest in some way. The contest is known for its association with the LGBT community. It's known for its association with diversity, with openness, with a sort of pan-European agenda. It functions as an opportunity to give people a 3-minute window into the cultural life of your country. For some countries that don't often get in the news otherwise, this is one of the only points of reference that people will get of them for the whole year. With that in mind, I think we can safely move past the EBU's argument, which is that Eurovision is an apolitical contest. Quite frankly, allowing countries to use the contest in a political way by doing nothing, putting your fingers in your ears and saying it's apolitical is in itself a political decision. You're allowing those countries to continue to use the contest to their own ends, to legitimize themselves, as we've discussed, to portray a certain image about themselves to the world. By refusing to engage in the conversation, you don't make the problem go away. You simply have made the political choice by default to allow the countries to use the contest in this way. That's why it's important that we talk about it. It's especially pertinent now, given that the EBU in recent years has removed countries for political reasons from the contest. Now let's first talk about a couple of examples where it was for straight up breaches of the rules. Firstly, Belarus. Belarus was removed from the contest because it sent a song that broke the rules on political lyrics. It was really clearly referencing the anti-government protests that had taken place in Belarus that year. There is another example of this, which was Georgia in 2009, slightly more on the nose this time. In the year after the invasion of Georgia by Russia, they sent a song called We Don't Wanna Put In. I'll let you guys figure that one out. Russia was different. Russia was removed from the contest for an abstract reason that wasn't related to a breach of the rules. That reason was that they brought the contest into disrepute. In my opinion, we can't really argue with that. Yes, Russia had absolutely brought the contest into disrepute, and they deserved to be expelled for that reason. The question here is, why has the EBU not taken the same action with Israel and with Azerbaijan? What's different this time? By removing Russia in this way, the EBU set a precedent, and at the time it was absolutely the right precedent to set. What that has meant is now many people have reasoned Israel has committed many widely documented breaches of international law. That's been documented by domestic Israeli human rights advocacy organizations such as B'Tselem as well. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's actions in the last year have resulted in the flight of more than 100,000 people from their homes. Why hasn't the EBU taken the same action with them? The answer to this question lies in the way that the EBU is structured. The EBU is made up of exclusively state broadcasters, state-owned, state-funded, with varying degrees of independence. We can expect that these broadcasters will always follow the geopolitical positioning of the states that fund them. What this means for Eurovision is every single country on a political level in Europe is against a boycott of either Israel or Azerbaijan. Every single country in Eurovision has a strategic or military partnership or relationship with at least one, if not both of them. This is the opposite to the situation with Russia, where European countries judged it was in their best interest to support Ukraine to the maximum degree possible. How that was borne out was that on day one of the full-scale invasion in 2022, sanctions were slapped on Russian officials, and there was a massive outcry at a state level against Russia. The broadcasters, by calling for the boycott of Eurovision if Russia was allowed to participate, or by calling for their expulsion, were simply following suit. They were towing the line. These broadcasters are following the same pattern now by either pretending these issues don't exist or deflecting responsibility onto the EBU to try and avoid flack. Ultimately, they won't contradict the geopolitical position of the state that ensures their existence. Calling for the removal of Israel or Azerbaijan from Eurovision would be doing exactly that. In my opinion, my analysis is that that is why no broadcaster has called for a boycott, even if some broadcasters have indicated that they're willing to have some conversation based on the choice of the artist who wins their national selections. This is why initiatives such as writing to broadcasters to call for the removal of Israel or Azerbaijan from the contest are proving fruitless. They are well-meaning in intent, but in reality, they're unlikely to succeed for that reason. That doesn't mean, far from it, that these kinds of civil actions are not important and valuable, because they raise awareness. Ultimately, they lead to more funding for initiatives helping Palestinians, helping Artsakhi refugees on the ground. My point is that while they're forces for good in that way, they're very unlikely to achieve their core objective, which is the removal of these countries from Eurovision. It should also be noted here that Moroccan Oil, which is one of the major sponsors of Eurovision, is an Israeli company. And so it's very unlikely for Eurovision to break that contract without an extraordinary amount of pressure. The actions of the states aside, with the reality being most likely that Israel and Azerbaijan will both participate in Eurovision 2024, content creators such as myself have to make a decision on how we cover them, because ultimately, with these shows, there will come a time where you inevitably have to talk about the Israeli act. You inevitably have to talk about the Azeri Act. Some fan sites have already made their position clear, where they've said they will engage in factual only coverage of the Israeli performer. The fact of the matter is, Eurovision doesn't exist in a vacuum, and Azerbaijan and Israel's participation, as we have discussed, do not exist in a vacuum. We've already seen imagery from the war in Gaza being tied into the promotion of Hakachav Haba, which is the Israeli national selection. In addition to that, the performance at Eurovision will serve the same purpose that it has done for many years, as we've discussed in this video. For that reason, uncritically covering a national final without this context serves to further that political message that the national final in question is trying to put across. Because of that, in-depth reporting and analysis has to take into account the material reality in which these participations exist. That means having conversations like the one we're having in this video and not shying away from it. This is the core of why I think it's important to make this video, and I'm going to link back to it through the season where necessary, because it's a conversation that has to be involved, that has to be part of what you're talking about every time you mention these entries. They simply do not exist independently of the material reality in which they have been sent to the contest. To be honest, in my opinion, not talking about this when you're talking about these entries to Eurovision misses half of the story. Further to that, it erases the thousands and thousands of innocent people who are ultimately, overwhelmingly, the victims of these conflicts. Those people have much bigger problems than working out what they should and shouldn't say in a YouTube video about Eurovision. I am extremely privileged to be able to sit here while so many people are terrified they won't even live to see tomorrow. I realize there is a lot more I could cover in this video, and nothing I can say will do justice to the 100+ years of turmoil that have led to these two current crises. But hopefully, at least, I have added something to the conversation about this, because it would not be responsible to pretend it wasn't there. Before I close up, I want to thank all of the Eurofans who've written dissertations on this subject and who sent them to me. Some of them are on screen now. Those who shared sources with me, who encouraged me to make this video, because it was the hardest video to record and the hardest video to write of any of the videos I've done on this channel. I also want to thank Anahit, who provided me an absolutely invaluable perspective on what the last few months have been like for people in Artsakh. If there's one piece of good that can come from this video, it should be that we support the innocent victims, the innocent civilians who are caught up in these conflicts. That's why in the description down below, you'll find a link to donate to medical aid for Palestinians and a link to support the education of children from Artsakh. That's where we're going to leave it for this week. And until next week, see you soon.